Dear audience, good evening and welcome to this seminar highlighting two productions of Salome, one by the Norwegian director Stefan Herheim that opened yesterday here in Oslo, and one by the Canadian director Atom Egoyan that just finished its run in Toronto a few days ago. My name is Maria. I'm the head of education and outreach here at the Norwegian National Opera and Ballet. And I'm stepping in for our artistic director, Per Boye Hanssen, who has obligations in Zurich tonight. But I also stand here because I know how this came about. What possessed us to set up a transatlantic live-streamed seminar and invite two of today's most influential opera directors. A research fellow here at the University of Oslo was writing her PhD on two productions of Salome, analyzing two in particular, the one by Stefan Herheim and the one by Atom Egoyan. And you can imagine her feeling when she discovered that we were going to program Salome here at the same time as she was going to hand in her thesis. And then she realized that they were going to restage Atom Egoyan's production in Canada at the same time. Too good to be true. So she approached me. We joined forces with my colleague in Toronto, Gianmarco Segato, and here we are. And we have invited you to listen, reflect, object, and pose questions. We have invited two scholars to give you background and input. And we have invited, of course, Atom Egoyan and Stefan Herheim. They have different starting points, but they both entered the operatic stage like a fresh breeze, or rather a tornado actually, and they've helped put both Toronto and Oslo on the international operatic map. So we're very, very happy to have all of you on board tonight, and we're happy to have a technical team that is making this event available both here, of course, and live stream on the internet. And this technical solution makes it possible for me to turn to Toronto and to our host there tonight, Brent Bambury. Good evening, Brent.
Hello, Maria.
Hello.
Hi. Nice to see you.
Fantastic. Nice to see you too.
Thank you very much. And hello to everyone in Oslo. Good evening to you. And good afternoon to all of our guests here in Toronto. Thank you for joining us today. I think it's going to be a really stimulating conversation for the next 2 hours. And lots of ideas will be floating back and forth between Oslo and Toronto. And you are part of the conversation, because we would definitely like it. If you have some questions to the two directors that we'll be meeting today, please share it with us. There are cards, I think, cards or paper being made available. Anything that you think of. And don't worry about what the question might be. If you have a question, it's a good question. Just put it down on the card or paper and raise your hand when you have one. And two of our aides will pick them up from you, and they will find their way to the stage, either here or in Oslo, and make their way to Stefan or to Adam. So please be a part of the conversation today. There's so much to talk about: modernity, Strauss, decapitation, lots of things that we can ask questions about, and I really hope you do. To welcome you from the Canadian Opera Company, I'd like to now welcome to the stage a man who joined us here in Toronto 4 years ago and impressed everyone instantly with his personality, but since then he's become a star because of his enormous talent before the orchestra as musical director of our finest productions. Please welcome the music director of the Canadian Opera Company, Johannes de Boos.
Thank you, Brent, for this introduction. A warm welcome to Oslo, and a special welcome to Stefan. I remember very well our days at the conservatory in Hamburg. So good to see you. I hope you're doing well, and you had a great opening night. You had a great opening night yesterday. I believe it was yesterday. I must admit, I'm a little bit old-fashioned, and I would rather like to have us all sitting in one room, maybe here in Toronto, because we have a really, really nice day. We could go for a drink afterwards. But anyway, today we embrace fully the new technology and that it is possible to live in this kind of virtual room and to discuss a piece that at the time of its making in 1905 had such an impact, and I would say the shock waves of this impact are still visceral. We can still feel them. As a conductor, of course, I'm thrilled to do this piece because of the sheer power, size of the orchestra, of the range of colors, of the extremities of expression. You have 106 musicians sitting there and creating in every bar so many levels, such a polyphony to kind of drive the drama forward. And I'm looking very, very much forward to hear from Stefan and from Atom a lot more about the meaning and the Bedeutung, I would say in German, of this piece nowadays for us. For me, it's the desire I can feel in every bar, starting from the beginning of the music, and getting to this culminating point at the very end when Salome sings, und das Geheimnis der Liebe ist größer als das Geheimnis des Todes. So the secret of love is deeper, is more profound than the secret of death. It's quite a journey, and I wish you a fruitful discussion from Toronto to Oslo, Oslo, Toronto. See you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Johannes. Great. Mimi in Oslo?
Yeah, thank you.
Over to you.
Yes, it's so good to be able to connect our audiences like this and then connect. Do you hear me twice? Anyway, we've connected both Stefan and Johannes again, and actually I can mention that I went to high school with Erica, who sang Salome with you in Toronto. So this is a small world actually, and she's coming here to sing Santa in May next year. Okay, let's get to what we actually came here for, talk about Salome. We are going to start with two talks to give you some background. Like I said, we've invited David Levin, professor of the University of Chicago. He's going to present a comparison of these two productions. And, but firstly, yes, of course, and the questions that Brent mentioned is going to come at the end. They have a system in Toronto. You hand them in via SMS here in Oslo. But first, you'll get to meet the fellow researcher with the great initiative and the incredible timing, Hedda Høgåsen-Hallesby.
Okay. Can you hear me? Right? Yeah.
Yes.
Good. During the last 6 years, I've had an affair with a girl. Her name is Salome, and I'm definitely not her first lover. The myth of this dancing girl awarded with the head of God's last prophet wanders through different times, different art forms and expressions. And Strauss's version of this story was based on Oscar Wilde's drama, written in 1891. Wilde's drama was inspired by Huysmans' novel Against Nature from 1884, again based on Moreau's Salome visions that he painted in the 1870s. And these ongoing interartistic influences continues in Salome adaptations of the 20th and 21st century. Either these are built on Wilde's drama, such as Ken Russell's film Salome's Last Dance, or the freer adaptations like the vampire Salome Agrippa, who in these days figures in the fifth season of the TV series True Blood, one of the 10 sexiest bad girls on TV right now. Salome's nomadic route through literature, visual art, stage, music, and popular culture makes her part of a mythic canonizing structure with open ends. And this open but dependent identity is especially pronounced in another of her contemporary appearances, In the seemingly ever-ongoing line of productions of Strauss's Salome, which is where my affair with Salome is rooted, as I've written my doctoral thesis on productions of Strauss's Salome, which, by the way, will never be just Strauss's Salome because opera forces him to share. As the story, the music, and the characters have to be performed and embodied, this involves a process not just of repeating the known story and the old songs, but also of recreation and of potential redefinition. Thus, when I started my affair with Salome, I didn't know her, or I didn't know the material I was going to work on. As this took form along the way, my arguments developed with the productions I was able to experience. And two of them made a particularly deep impression on me. One of them was Atom Egoyan's production, staged in 1996, again in 2002, and now again in 2013. And the other was Stefan Herheim's version from 2011, also restaged now in 2013. And the stories of these two productions can be seen as continuations of the long history of the Salome myth as a story of shocks and provocations, or of recycled shocks, which is what I want to focus on tonight. I believe these recycled shocks are the results of the phenomenon of opera production taking place between historical texts and present bodies, between something conservative and something utterly radical. And this phenomenon fascinates me immensely. It points to the questions that many of us deal with in one way or another. How do we take what already exists, be it texts, histories, myths, or curricula, and bring them to life? How do we make them relevant, attractive, and moving? My way to Salome went by one of her operatic sisters. I did my master thesis on dancing Oriental women from the 1870s, one of them being, of course, Carmen. Both Salome and Carmen are demanding, seducing, and fatal women who dance and die. The feminist-oriented branch of opera scholarship has thus used Salome and Carmen to claim opera as being about the undoing of women, which have to be ritualistically killed and destroyed in the end so that control and normality can be re-established and confirmed. We know, at least I know, that this is just one part of the overall picture. I don't know if any of you have seen Anne Sophie von Otter as Carmen in the production by David McVicker, but when I first saw her do the habanera with a cigar and everything, I knew that what I had read did not line up at all with Carmen in performance. It is not just Don José that has to give in here. This performance powerfully demonstrates how opera is an ongoing negotiation of meaning emerging between repeated text, encompassing the score and libretto and previous interpretations on the one hand, and present embodiments on the other. And in this negotiation, opera goes from being about the textual undoing of women to demonstrating the present and voicing of them, both literally and metaphorically. And when turning to Salome, I must admit that I expected some of the same. Her dance of the 7 veils could have been the pinnacle of all dances, as this is a story about a young girl that becomes aware that her weapon and path to power is her performing body. In Strauss's opera, however, Salome's alliance with a diva means an alliance with a body that is not primarily trained as a dancer. Yet it has to fill an enormous frame in terms of audience focus, physical space, and time. And to me, Salome's dance became somewhat of a thrilling irritation or friction in this story and the opera. And in 2008, I presented my preliminary thoughts at a conference in London under a title taken from the TV series, So You Think You Can Dance. And there I met Carol Clark from the University of Toronto, who enthusiastically told me about a Salome production staged at the Canadian Opera Company by famous Canadian filmmaker Atom Egoyan. And my curiosity was utterly supported when I read an article by David Levin called Operatic School for Scandal, that expressed a similar enthusiasm. And all of a sudden, I was on a plane to Toronto to see this archival recording. And there, in a small office at the COC on a very low-tech TV screen, I saw a version of Salome that made her uncannily present, and never the same again. This happened toward the end of the dance, where an enormous projection of a clear blue eyeball appeared and replaced the brutal sight of a gang rape performed as a veiled shadow play. Not everyone liked what Egoyan's production revealed. In Toronto, I was also given access to some reviews from 2002, one of them by the critic Tamara Bernstein, bearing the title, "A Night of Violation both on a musical and personal level." Bernstein concluded by stating, quote, "It is important to get over the arch notion that we're under a moral obligation to keep presenting great masterpieces," unquote. And this review led to a rare event. A reply from the director who wrote a defense of his production in the same newspaper, in which he exclaimed, "What a predictable response. If something disturbs our sensuality, let's proceed to ban it," unquote. And Salome's performance history, which is also a history of censorships, confirms Egoyan's accusations of predictability. At one level, the repeated myth of the princess and the head can be read as a story of shock effects, a catalogue of provocations. It is about showing what is supposed to be veiled. That could be the female body, women's sexuality, forbidden desire, homoeroticism, incest, dismembered heads. Yet, in this history, the repeated myths function as a reference to previous provocations is arguably more important than its function as a producer of them. Like Strauss's opera became a reference to the scandals of Oscar Wilde, and like Wilde followed up on Huysmans' candid descriptions of morose sexually revealing Salome images. This might lead us to conclude that Egoyan's production conventionally follows the shocks of the Salome history. So also with Herheim's Salome. In their marketing of the premiere, the Salome that premiered yesterday, the Norwegian National Opera and Ballet uses Salome's position as a history of shocks, but also the provoking tradition of the director's opera. And I quote from their website, "Since the original premiere in 1905, this piece has represented the greatest challenge for all directors. As Salome produced a scandal back then, Stefan Herheim's production was both a clear genius and controversial upon its premiere in Salzburg in 2011, unquote. And by this short description, establishing a line from the reactions to Herheim's production in 2011 to the shocks it created when it first premiered in Dresden, the institution simultaneously warns, teases, and tempts its audience, turning what they hopefully will get a chance to see into a framed and prepared shock. This is a characteristic of the 20th century tradition of the Regietheater, often referred to as Regie opera, a practice whereby canonized operas are recontextualized and visually updated. Hence, the radical tradition of the Regie opera is dependent on a canon of repeated works. Yet it is also dependent on the canon's open spaces for mediation, embodiment, and particularity, that in opera is given a very clear expression through the empty and open stage that has to be filled every time the same text is repeated. And it might be filled with content radically changing the story we thought we know and the music we love, as when Egoyan's production staged the story of Salome as a story of sexual abuse. Herheim's production changes the story and the meaning of the music when the 3 final C minor strokes in the orchestra are used to accompany not the assassination of Salome, but the execution of Herod. He is shot by an enormous ocular instrument, a combination of a cannon and a phallic telescope. And this instrument serves an important role in this production's version of the dance. To its glamorous introduction, Salome enters the little platform in front of its eyepiece, which becomes a stage for a show she will direct. Here then, the dancing Salome, the spectacle throughout history, becomes the spectator, the one who looks through the eyepiece and promptly destroys the moon by shooting a hole through it. And in its crater, a little dancing figure appears, first as a projection and then as an actual person, a professional dancer. This happens 5 more times until there are 6 doubles of the princess directing from her platform. And the doublings of Salome underlines and confirms her status as an object. Simultaneously, they make it impossible to focus on her as any one object in particular, as the 7 Salomes disrupt the possibility of one fixed or unified perspective. The long dance of Salome represents a problem, but also an enormous potential. The open space of this canonized text, waiting to be filled in by the particularity of an individual staging. And Salome contains yet another example demonstrating this area, and that is the prophet's silent head appearing just before the prince's final monologue. Because of Salome's canonic status, as well as the myth's numerous adaptations, it is likely that audiences to Strauss's opera know how this will turn out. They know that in the end she will get what she wants on that silver platter. Thus, although they expect to encounter a spectacle when the head is about to appear, they don't know the way it will occur. And these expectations are in the opera supported musically and met by a moment of silence. One of the remarkably few places in this score where the dense orchestral web of Strauss is cut off and holds its breath in a fermata general pause. Except from a crescendo drum roll, this bar consists only of a written text describing this extremely physical event, where the repeated text kind of leaves room for a materiality that only a concrete production can offer. And believe me, this is an opportunity for a spectacular staging that directors and producers know how to utilize. Awaiting the appearance of the Baptist head in Herheim's production in Salzburg, I guess I was not the only one who expected something spectacular. After all, we waited the moment of materiality staged by a director known for his ability to surprise. And as some of you already know, Herheim and his team do not let us down here when they let one of the biggest Johannan heads ever seen in the production history of this opera appear from the subterranean cistern. The silent head of the prophet has been described as a provocation to discourse, an object calling for comment, elaboration, and explanation. When Julia Kristeva curated an exhibition at the Musée de Louvre in 1998 with decapitated heads, this was one of the aspects she wanted to emphasize. And in the catalog, she stresses that although the vast number of decapitated heads has made this image into a, quote, museumized subject with an established horror, unquote, it also carries a promise of ongoing transgressions. According to Kristeva, the decapitated head represents a quote-unquote privileged space, a silent gap onto which artists and viewers have made their own projections. This head is a telling image that creates an urge to retell. It is provokingly mute and dead, yet encouraging new creations, thus representing a somewhat paradoxical encounter between silence and speech, life and death. The decapitated head of an orator that continues to sing is a well-known element in the history of opera through the myth of Orpheus. And also in Herheim's production, the mouth of the dead Baptist continues to sing, as the gaping void of the prophet's mouth is filled, literally, by the body of the female performer staging the young Judean princess. The mouth of God's mouthpiece becomes an open space, a stage that Salome enters. Recalling the position of the decapitated head, Herheim's production indeed functioned as a giant provocation to discourse, at least to reactions, heard as a loud boo from the audience in Salzburg. And I don't know what this actually referred to. It could have been the simulation of sex on stage, or the prince's revenge, or the blasphemous or potential blasphemous spectacle of the head. But what we do know is that these sounds of the audience that we're not quite used to here in Oslo are the sounds of devotion, but also the sounds of conventions, an echo of the conventional shock found in the Salome myth, as well as in the practice of the director's opera. This is a shock that is expected, even institutionalized, as the directorial experimentations of the avant-garde theater is brought into one of the most established artistic bastions, the opera house. Provocation somewhat paradoxically becomes convention. Like Herod, in the opera responds not mainly to the spectacle of the head, but to the sight of Salome kissing it and interacting with it. What makes the audience to the regie opera react is not the director's interaction with the material. And while the reviewer I quoted attributed her verdict to the repetition of Salome in principle, what she really reacted to was the doing of this opera in production. Changing and challenging what we thought we knew, such a retelling can certainly be provocative, both on a musical and personal level, to quote the reviewer. Still, I find it to be a part of the conventional provocation that follows canonizing processes, where the already existing is brought to life again and again. On the one hand, such a process results in a consolidation of an existing row of masterworks. On the other hand, these open spaces of the repetitions would challenge the content of this row constantly. Opera has been called a museum art form. And whereas museums are institutions and buildings containing mostly dead objects, the museum art form of opera recalls the museumized object of the decapitated head, and how the content of this museum must be brought to life, filled and voiced by curation and presentation. Salome's death right before the curtain call does not reduce her vitality, does it? Neither does the opera world's strong dependence on a consistent canon and necessitate the absence of innovations or new creations. The ongoing repetitions of these museum forms make it possible to repeat what has never been said, to step into the blind spots or open areas and fill them with content that makes the known exhibition look different. Here, the prophet's mouth can be filled with the performing body of the soprano or the flaming desire of the young princess. And the resulting multitude of versions disrupt the possibility of one fixed or unified perspective, recalling the effect of the 7 dancing Salomes. And that is why I think we are under a moral obligation to keep presenting the great masterpieces, to negotiate their vital content and thrilling irritations, and fight the notion that they come with only one pre-assigned or predetermined baggage, with one truth or one message. And this does not mean that I believe every new version is a good version, but that the experimentations of the regie opera represents a fitting partner to the established opera canon, a partnership that sheds light on the continuity rather than the opposition between provocations and conventions, the known and the unknown, history and presence. And on its ongoing journey to a new stage, a new body, or a new perspective, the repeated myth or the canonized opera would always escape our passionate embrace, changing and challenging the story, the songs, or the Salome we thought, at least I thought, I knew. Yet personally, I find this to enhance rather than to reduce my passion for her. Thank you.
Hello. First off, I want to thank some of the people who have put this remarkable event together. Hedda Høgåsen-Hallesby of the University of Oslo, Maria af Klinteberg-Herresdal at the Norwegian National Opera and Ballet. As you can see, I don't speak Norwegian. Gianmarco Segato at the Canadian Opera Company. While opera houses have, over the past quarter century, come to share productions, Atom Egoyan Salome was co-produced by Vancouver, Houston, and the Canadian Opera Company, while Stefan Herheim's Salome was co-produced by Salzburg, Madrid, and the Norwegian National Opera. This is the first time, to my knowledge, that two houses have come together to sponsor a joint discussion of two different productions. Happily, in this case, these are two productions that don't just warrant a conversation, but demand an exchange. The similarities between these two astonishing productions are as surprising and exciting as the differences. And I should say, the static that you hear is surely the mark of the invention that we're experiencing, right? Which is to say, we haven't done it before, so excuse us while we work out some of the wrinkles. Of course, it would have been convenient if the productions in question had been presented in the same house, or at least in the same city, maybe even the same country, or on the same continent. But since that wasn't to be, it's fallen to me to effect a long-distance introduction. It's a slightly daunting task, not just to introduce two complex and compelling productions to audiences that haven't seen one of them, but to describe two complex and compelling productions to audiences that have seen one of them, since half of you may well have an acute sense of all that I am omitting in the description. And of course, it's not that easy to describe two complex and compelling productions in the presence of their directors, who will have an even more acute sense of all that has been omitted in the description. It's enough to put even the most zen of professors on edge. I'll do my best to set all of that aside and get on with the introductions. But first, I'm going to switch out my mic. In the Canadian Opera Company production in Toronto, we see Salome on screen long before she appears on stage. And Atom Egoyan derives not just a theatrical effect from this gambit, but a dramaturgical focus. Salome is not the only figure we encounter on screen. Whenever Johannan sings, we see his mouth menacingly and eerily disembodied, projected live in a screen space within a wall at the rear of the stage. Of course, for the most part, we don't see Johannan, since he's imprisoned in an underground cistern. By incorporating these visual media, a live video feed and film, the production in Toronto offers us more than a glimpse of its principal figures off stage. It expands the space that would encompass Salome's surveillance and Johannan's presence. Derek McLean sets the work on ambivalent, threatening grounds. The stage evokes a sinister cross between a geriatric Club Med, a minimum security prison, and a sanatorium. The reigning atmosphere is not fun, but surveillance. The point is well taken. After all, it's a spa to Herod and his clan, but a prison to Johannan. The set, costumes, and lighting conspire to render this contradiction palpable. Here, luxury and incarceration are interconnected. They literally and figuratively bleed into one another. The production suggests that the excesses of the world above inevitably spill over into, and thus draw our attention to, the privations below. When, in the fourth scene, Herodias sends the small mountain of tamgelos tumbling down the deeply raked stage, the stage that you see here, Salome, Yohanan, and Naraboth, thus freeing up space in the rather sizable clear plastic fruit bowl for Yohanan's head. Many of the bright fruits come to rest in front of a netherworld of gray piping. These are the visible traces of Yohanan's world. When the prophet first appears in the flesh on stage, the image that you see here, he's wheeled out from that netherworld on a freight cart, a delivery of excess moral baggage. And Salome? She occupies a space, aptly a deep and unstable diagonal between the two. Fascinated by the dank and suppressed place occupied by Yohanan, indifferent to the grotesque lavishness of the realm shared by her mother and stepfather. Thus, in Egoyan's account, Salome is a tourist in a volatile, unstable border region, separating abandon from incarceration, sex from renunciation, and those who belong from those who don't. In this border region, Strauss's soldiers become part of a security apparatus keeping a watchful eye over matters, which is to say, keeping a watchful eye on Salome, on Yohanan, imprisoned down in that cistern, even on Herod, Herodias, and the grounds more generally. Anyone who has seen Egoyan's films will not be surprised by this pervasive sense of surveillance, which has formed a thematic node in many of his films, from Family Viewing of 1988 to Exotica from 1994 to Chloe, recently, of 2009. But surveillance is only part of the story. If everyone at Herod's court is looking, and of course their looking is warranted by the libretto, the production is also interested in presenting the court as a haven for neurotic, even perverse intimacies. Thus, at the very outset of the production, Naraboth's famous opening line about Salome's beauty, "Wie schön ist die Prinzessin Salome heute Nacht," is delivered quite incongruously, quite disconcertingly, as the page is passionately embracing him. And I can be allowed the brief diversion. I should note that essentially the same configuration, Naraboth lusting intensely after Salome, while the page lusts intensely after Naraboth, characterizes Stefan Herheim's production here in Oslo. From the very outset, Egoyan's production doesn't simply stage the piece's heavy traffic in desire. It also inflects that traffic as oddly, even cruelly oblivious. Here, too, there are striking similarities between what transpires on the stage in Toronto and Oslo, and we'll surely get to talk about that shortly. Thus, Salome's increasingly intense and bizarre relationship with Yohanan is mirrored in a similar register by the page's highly sexualized relationship with Naraboth. As Salome sings of her desire for Yohanan's body, the page unbuttons her suit jacket and, at the same time, caresses Naraboth's bare chest through his shirt. In turn, Yohanan's denunciations are enacted by Naraboth, who rejects the page's amorous expressions with a physical force calibrated to Yohanan's growing vocal ferocity. This particular relay effect itself relays an important interpretive insight, namely that there is a bizarre network of gazes and power in this work, where the page longs for Naraboth, who longs for Salome, who longs for Yohanan, who longs for the coming of the Lord. Thus, in Egoyan's account, violent desire isn't restricted to Salome or inflected as something peculiar to her, but it emerges instead as a condition of sexual relations tout court at Herod's court. Despite her visible and visibly sexual desire, Erika Sundgaard Salome still also seems dazed and confused, captivated by Johannan in a childlike, hesitant fashion. How then do Sundgaard and Egoyan resolve the disjunction between this childlike innocence and the gruesome murder she instigates at the work's conclusion? The disjunction, quite simply, is produced and resolved by her infamous dance. Here, rather than the by now utterly predictable shock of Salome dancing until she drops that seventh veil at Herod's feet, we're presented with another entirely startling scene. As the familiar music for the dance commences, Salome heads over to a swing suspended near the front of the stage. But rather than simply dance her dance on the swing, as we might expect, Salome and the swing are suddenly pulled up into the rafters, out of sight, and the folds of her train extend improbably but completely into a screen filling the entirety of the proscenium below. As the singer disappears into the rafters, the work appears to metamorphose into a grand silent movie spectacle. Thus, the dance emerges here as a fundamentally different scene. Not just different from the scene that spectators familiar with Strauss's opera might be expecting, but stylistically, generically, and referentially different from the surrounding scenes within this work. In the dance, Egoyan combines a set of weirdly elusive filmic fragments, shadow play, and live action, which culminates in an astonishing account of Salome dancing for, and eventually, at the final orchestral climax of the dance, being raped by the members of Herod's court. The rape is explicit, but it's also aestheticized. And in the latest version of this production, it's further offset by the introduction of a shadow play created by the Montreal-based shadow designer Clea Maneker. It's unclear whether the scene is to be understood as taking place here and now, or whether the stage has been given over to a recollection of a trauma that transpired in the remote past. Either way, the shadow dance as rape scene offers a retroactive explanation for Salome's dazed character at the outset and throughout the production, as it explains the perversity at its conclusion. She's a survivor, as Hedda told us, of domestic abuse. The conclusion of the work is as surprising as the dance. Traditionally, Salome would be killed impersonally, crushed by the collective and anonymous force of the soldiers' shields. Egoyan's account is much more personal. As the final ominous tutti chords resound in the orchestra, Herod snatches a blindfold from Salome, the blindfold that you see on the image here, one that she in turn had taken from Johannan's decapitated head. And Herod strangles her fiercely, abruptly, rhythmically. We switch to Oslo. A number of similar ideas inform Stefan Herheim's production here in Oslo. But if in Toronto we first see Salome on screen, it's noteworthy that in Oslo we see Elisabeth Blanke Biggs as Salome on stage, albeit in screen attire, sporting a dress that recalls Marilyn Monroe in Some Like It Hot. The audience can be forgiven for being a bit disoriented, not only because Salome's appearance replicates Marilyn Monroe's, but because the opening exchange between Narabeth and the page is doubled on the Oslo stage by two further figures, mirror images, dressed identically and mouthing the very same words, up above the main stage on a kind of upper rim that separates the three realms of this production. The central focus on the main stage is a massive instrument. We saw it before, Hedda showed it to us. It looks like a telescope, but will function, as she suggested, variously as a cannon as well as a bridge and a spotlight. This instrument is mounted just to the side of what will turn out to be the roof of Johannan's crypt below. At the outset of the production, the telescope is focused upon a giant moon that fills the rear scrim that fills the upper half of the stage. At times, that moon and the walls of the extraterrestrial world on the main stage below will give way to projections of other galactic and intergalactic matter. The scenic parameters here are grand indeed, and so too is the frame of reference. And yet, I need to make clear that the production, thus released from a specific worldly setting, is in many ways entirely of this world. Which is to say, it's populated by figures who are not only familiar, or let's say, historically legible, but whose actions are entirely contemporary. Indeed, I'd go further and say that while the production is set in the stratospheres, its interpersonal calibration is very much of the street. So why the other and outer worldly setting? Well, for one, it keys the audience into the fundamental weirdness of the world that is posited in Strauss's piece. And both productions do this in different but related ways. In the COC production, the stage occupies an unstable space between the worlds of a resort, a prison, and an asylum. In Oslo, that instability takes astronomic or even galactic form. The stage occupies a similarly unstable space, albeit worlds between worlds in space. The recourse to the far, far away enables Herheim and his set designer Heike Scheele to sharpen a paradox that animates their interpretation. Namely, that the world of Salome, even a Salome in orbit, is a deeply claustrophobic and constricted world. Even set out in the galaxies, there appears to be no exit from this piece. The characters are inflected in this production as inexorably and irredeemably shut in. Thus, there's very little color, which is in this piece, which is resolutely set in an irreconcilable idiom of black and white, with one obvious and important distinction, exception. That sense of constriction to black and white is reinforced by the doubling to which I alluded a moment ago. Our first encounter with the world of Salome is an encounter with duplication. The page at the bottom of the screen here in the middle, and Narabath at the bottom of the screen and to the left between the guards. On the main stage, those two are doubled by Herod and Herodias up above. The hairdos are the same. Both men sport the same brunette ponytail and full mustaches and beards. Both women wear the same brunette hair with straight bangs, bracketed by shoulder-length locks. The dresses and evening attire are the same, and the color palette, the men wear white while the women wear black, is the same as well. And when Johannan appears, he too is wearing the same outfit. His jacket is rather the worse for wear. Being imprisoned will do that to the finest of vestments. His hair is emphatically more disheveled, and his beard is fuller. In Oslo, the figures of the royal court are presented here as mirror images of one another. This is a hugely suggestive move, one that enables Herheim and his team to further tighten the noose that constrains the circulation and assertion of these characters. Way out there in the cosmos, the differences between these figures have become exceedingly difficult to discern. And yet, my hunch is that the explanation for this sartorial similarity has less to do with space as the place of their encounter than a sense of there being essentially no discernible difference in the psychology that motivates these figures. In Herheim's account of the world of Salome, boys will be boys. And thus, Herod, Narabath, and Johannan occupy places on a continuum, from Herod's heavily ornamented vocal line and hypersexualized extroversion at one extreme, to Johannan's unadorned stentorian vocal line and hyper-religious extroversion, or we might say, from the perspective of the piece and the production, his hyper-repressed religious extroversion at the other extreme. And then there's Naroboth, who occupies a space in the middle, like Herod and Johannan, a place of intense and intensely unfulfilled desire, combining ardor with violence, absorption with oblivion, albeit with a vocal ornamentation that is more modest than that of Herod, and a clarion declamatory style less stentorian than that of Johannan. And yet, amidst the jarring similarities that became clear to me only upon a second viewing, or from a seat up close enough to afford a detailed view, it turns out that Naroboth and the page wear sequined costumes, while their superiors, geographically and politically, Herod and Herodias, wear less garish, presumably more natural fabrics without sequins. This isn't an idle observation, but rather it alerts us to an important dynamic in the Herheim production, a play between the stars understood in an astronomical sense and stars understood in a more worldly sense. Salome as Marilyn Monroe is a star, and she's certainly a star in the social world of this opera, where everyone is forever looking at her. Herheim plays with this conjunction, allowing it to figure largely in his visual field. Thus, the massive moon that looms over the set offers a sense of the on-stage world as unhinged, out of any regular orbit. But by outfitting the world below with sequins, Herheim inflects the interactions of the characters caught on this lost planet with a recurring streak of theatricalized play. That is, his characters occasionally and incongruously resort to the showy group gestures and stock behavior of Broadway musicals. The social world of Salome, in Herheim's account, is not a monological one. Or for that matter, it's not a contained world either. It's instead a world that shifts idioms on a dime, or I suppose on a kroner, from the delicate intimacy of an Ingmar Bergman film, or for that matter, of an Atom Egoyan film, to the stagey show business of a Busby Berkeley film, from the gory violence and lurid sexual encounters of a Quentin Tarantino film, to the comical circulation of a crazy conglomeration of historical personages in the crowd of guests at the palace that seems to me to be lifted from the pages of the famous French comic strip series Asterix. Given this profusion, and given how little time we have, it's difficult to do justice to the volcano of ideas, idioms, and events in this production. So let me focus upon one. In the Dance of the Seven Veils, Herheim allows the multiple worlds of his production to meet. He does so literally and figuratively. Here, the lunar world sends emissaries in the form of a series of dancing Salomes. Hedda talked about this a bit earlier. Those emissaries are sent to the world of the main stage below from the moon far above. In the process, the world of diverting theatricality meets up with the world of carnal violence, and the fantasy world of projection meets up with the real world of the everyday. Paradoxically, there's something supremely diverting in this dystopian show. To launch the dance, Salome mounts the telescope cum cannon and sends off a lunar shot that blows a hole in the planet upon which the telescope is focused. In that hole, a reclining female figure appears, in shadow form and much to the delight of the assembled guests at Herod's court, who have quickly and eagerly assembled to watch the ensuing show. The crowd of guests, we should note, has morphed into a celebrity audience, like at Cannes or Salzburg, consisting of the contentious Jews, as well as an assortment of Muslim and Greek Orthodox Christian elders and not just religious figures, but historical personages, Hitler, Caesar, and others. The shadow spectacle up there in the hole in the moon involves a series of gyrating showgirls, each, like Salome, young and blonde. And each bump and gyration elicits a delighted group moan or yelp from the crowd below. One by one, having performed to the oohs and ahs of the assembled guests, they're expelled from their prelapsarian perch and fall to earth, bouncing into the stage world, metamorphosed and a bit bewildered and upset in the process, from screen images into real-life emanations amidst their real-life and adoring fans. The series of 6 sister Salomes from another planet, add the one already on stage and you've got 7 to correspond with the 7 veils. This series suggests an insight and a dynamic that merits our attention. For it materializes once again how in this production, Salome exists in a space between otherworldly projection and an all-too-present embodiment, pleasurable theatrical diversion and menacing physical intrusion, light waltz and advanced harmonic experimentation. Eventually, the dancing girls who've come down to us in a series of dazzling, colorful, and sequined 7-year itch dresses, and what is it with the number 7, will dispense with their dresses and the niceties of their gyrations and pull out knives with which they will slit the throats of the now partying guests in whose midst they've been dancing. As in the COC production, this act of violence is aestheticized. The throat slitting enables the girls to pull long scarves of blood, as you see here, from their dance partners, with which in turn they round up the remaining dignitaries, whom they in turn dispatch before jumping into the cistern from which Johannan emerged at the beginning of the opera. Like so many scenes in this production, this one is chaotic and hugely suggestive. In Herheim's production, scenes of violence morph seamlessly into scenes of intimacy, which morph seamlessly into scenes of theatricality. This is theater that operates according to a logic of accretion, juxtaposition, and play. Viewers are treated to a scene where an enormous amount transpires at the same time. In that sense, we might say that Herheim's production offers us a scenic correlative to Strauss's overwhelming orchestral forces and contradictory compositional proclivities. A last paragraph. I want to close with that point in mind. Whereas the Egoyan production, especially in 2013, seems all the more cogent in its commitment to rendering a specific and horrific family history that is coherent, and the production renders as coherent. The Herheim production in Oslo seems intent on rendering and not resolving what we might term the piece's expressive heterogeneity, its diverse musical and dramatic strands, or the mystery invoked at its conclusion. If both of these productions have a whiff of turn-of-the-century Vienna to them, we might say that they key into different aspects of Sigmund Freud's practice. While Egoyan's account of Salome is more of a case study, where Salome takes up a place in a set of diagnostic histories like Anna O or the Rat Man, who have suffered a trauma that the work of interpretation seeks to understand and unveil. The Herheim production lands us in a dreamscape that is not internally consistent, that does not aspire to internal consistency. This, then, is more the Freud of the interpretation of dreams, a place where characters and events are at once uncannily familiar and profoundly unfamiliar, alerting us at once to what we know and what we don't, what we recognize and what we can't, what we understand and what remains beyond our grasp. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Hedda. Okay. That was great. There's so much to think about. You've given us a lot to think about and much to talk about. And I want to remind our audience here in Toronto that you will have a chance to address some of these questions to the creators of the operas that David just described very thoroughly for us, and with an awful lot of interpretation that I think is useful in trying to especially understand a production that we might not have seen. I suppose that in both Oslo and in Toronto, we do have people with us who've seen at least one of the productions that we're talking about, so that will be useful. And I want to remind all of you to please put your questions down on paper and to indicate that you have them for us, and we will present them to the directors that we're about to meet. So, in Toronto, here with us today, it's my great pleasure to welcome a director of opera who first actually made his mark in opera with Salome back in 1992. He is, of course, the director also of some dozen feature films, which are renowned. They're impeccable. They're brilliant. They deal with the theme of human experience, of memory, of psychology, and intimacy. And we welcome to the stage right now the director, most recently, of the Canadian Opera Company's production of Salome. Please welcome Atom Egoyan.
Hello. Hello.
Thanks for being with us.
Sure.
So Salome, as we've just learned, has been interpreted for millennia, and she's had different meanings depending, I think, on the time that she was being interpreted or on the context. And we're talking about a play here with the Strauss production. We're talking about a play that was written in the first decade, an opera that was created in the first decade of the 20th century, which had its own context, certainly a modern interpretation and a certain depth to the character of Salome. So just through the lens of this opera and the music, what does Salome, the character, mean to you?
She's a person. She's an individual. She's someone to be examined, someone to be portrayed, someone to be understood. I think the experience that she has survived is traumatic, and my understanding that is informed by what the story offers, and what, in particular, Wilde suggested in his interpretation of the story from the Bible, from the biblical account. He made certain accommodations, and what Strauss then suggests, coming from this great Germanic tradition of using the orchestra to give us access into the subconscious world of these characters, what one notices in both Strauss's music and certainly in Wilde's text is the notion of elaboration, the need to describe, the need to put words or to suggest through music something that we don't have access to immediately, that is beyond our grasp. And that ripples through the piece in a number of ways, but it is at once something that suggests a longing, the arrival in a place that you are not in, that you wish to be in, as a means of escape, as a means perhaps of survival, and as a cleansing, as a way of finding something that's pure. So then the question becomes, well, what is impure? Why is that tainted? And those are all dramatic considerations, and they go back to the notion of character, and that's my interest. I mean, I'm certainly I'm excited by the visual possibilities, but first and foremost, it's about the psychological understanding of the character.
Okay, and in doing that, in creating what is, I think, a radical interpretation of the character by giving the story, giving the narrative to what happens to Salome during the Dance of Seven Veils, what did you hear in the music that made the suggestion to you? In the segment of music that Strauss created for the dance, what is it? I mean, I know you're also a musician. What is it that you heard in the music?
Turbulence, upheaval, shifting shifting points of view, but this notion to entertain. And I think that one of the, again, going back to this notion of where the place ends up with this horrifying and extreme action.
Salome's action.
Action, yes, of asking for this very violent end. One of the things we understand about a character who is surviving the ordeal of abuse is a hypersexualization as well. And so that became very interesting to me. This notion that the music becomes hypersexualized in a way that that character may not be at that moment. It anticipates something. And that might come from the fact that as a filmmaker, I'm actually now on this week starting work with my composer, Michael Dana, on the score for the new film. And we have a lot of dialogue about what the score will do, but as an opera director, I'm given that score. I'm not going to change it. So it's exciting to me then to resist the score, maybe not to go where it's going, and to suggest some sort of tension as a result. And that, I mean, how amazing is it to have 8 minutes of music where there's something very programmatic. It's a dance. But we say that, well, there may be a dance going on, but let's resist that, and let's actually go to what the origins of that dance, or the need to display the sexuality so demonstratively, where that comes from. And also, I mean, it's a historic investigation as well. Look, we never talk about where Wilde was when he wrote this text. I mean, you know, this was a person who was feeling the beginnings of this upheaval in his own life, this need to be understood, this sense of being victimized, the sense of being punished for something that he was feeling, and where it would ultimately lead to this tragic, awful end to his life. So whether or not he was addressing that in a conscious way, which I don't think he was, but it's certainly there in terms of his choice of the material and what he did with the material, what the deviations that he made from, again, the biblical account. So all of those are factors that I bring in to my work. And certainly one of the things that this remount made clear is that this production was sandwiched between two films, Exotica and The Sweet Hereafter, that were both dealing with notions of abuse. One of them from a dancer in Exotica, someone who and you know, the late great Richard Bradshaw, who was the artistic director of the COC, saw that film and made that link. So I give a lot of credit to that. But so the notion of dance and again, playing out a sexualized version of something that has been damaged was anticipating the next film as well, with Sweet Hereafter, where the abuse is much more, it's murky in terms of where that victim is, in terms of their understanding of their own experience. So this was a very interesting piece because it was so out there. It was so extreme. There was no way of traipsing around what the effect would be, because this woman ends up asking for something so violent.
So why is she attracted and I know that this is a question that a lot of people have asked, but why is she so attracted to Johannes? What is the nature of what does she understand what she wants from him?
Well, she understands that her father is scared, that it's a new order, that something is being overturned. So
that all the power, the pervading power that's
right.
in it.
But there's also a moral code. There's also, I think, something we don't talk about is that if this was the New Testament, and if it was Jesus would have looked at her. Jesus would have actually had a more open contact. But we're talking about Old Testament, and it's blunt, and it's judgmental, and there's punishment. And you know, from the moment Johannes, you know, talks about the incestuous ways of the mother, you know, of this trollop, you know, this biblical trollop who's, you know, cavorting with Assyrians, heaven forbid. So there's this sense that she's just it's someone who is questioning this world that she's been forced to accept, and that's got to be attractive to her. As to who he is, I mean, the fetishization soon takes over any relationship to her contact with him as an individual. It's all about, it's a figurative desire. And that's what drives her to this place. She's been treated as a figure. No one's really understood her. If you looked at me, as she says repeatedly, if you had looked at me, you would have loved me. But no one has ever looked at her. And Herod says at one point quite explicitly, maybe I looked at you too much. So it has all the hallmarks of a very traumatic upbringing in this household.
When David was talking about surveillance and the initial images, the images of the eyes, Johannen's mouth as we see it from prison, and then that very dramatic image of Johannen being brought out of the cistern, and it made me think, although this was conceived in 1992, 10 years later, we were living in a post-surveillance world after 9/11, and I wonder, as you revisited the opera, whether that occurred to you, or whether that was
it did,
part of
and there was some question of modernizing it all and bringing in cell phone technology and all the type of stuff, the stuff that we're using now, and it just seemed that there was, once you open that door, then it becomes something else, and we thought it'd be interesting to actually restage it in its original version as it was presented in the mid-90s. That being said, there were major differences in this manifestation. Now that the technologies had shifted from analog to the digital world, we lost some magic. There's no question about it. In terms of the projections and what they did, there was something lost, even though it was way more efficient and practical and less scary, because we weren't dealing with moving glass slides and 16mm projection loops. We had to then reintroduce that through another way, and that became the work, Cleo's work with the puppetry and the shadow work and the cutout dolls. So to give it that physical sense.
And I just have to ask you, Hedda alluded to the critical reception of the original staging of the sexual assault, and some critics didn't find it acceptable at the time. Tell me about that and the effect that had on Remounting.
Do you know, I went for it in a pretty blunt way because it was such a strong idea, and I think it was interesting this time around because some of the critics were saying, well, did you try and soften it? And that wasn't a conscious decision. We still end with the notion of if it's not a gang rape, it's a rape that's being witnessed by other people. But it's in keeping with what the script is doing and what the music is doing. It needed to be it had to be more elusive. It had to feel more as though there was an elaboration. And so the shadow work became much more figurative and dreamy and poetic, with the use of branches coming from the forest that she's walking in. And it just felt it was more in keeping with the tone and texture of the music. I reacted to that initial critical volley. Maybe I overreacted. I never respond to critics. I don't know what I think it was. There was something particularly strident and upsetting about that particular review, and I don't usually do that. I think everyone's entitled to an opinion. It just felt there was something so puritanical about the tone of it, and I felt and I felt misinformed. I don't think that critic actually understood that a lot of the actions in the piece were actually within the piece. They weren't introduced through the interpretation. Everything was quite literal, though reduced, though concentrated.
We will let the audience ask some questions.
I'm told to look up there to look at Oslo, but then I have to look down here to look at Toronto. So in a way, that becomes. I have a bifurcated head myself, so but it's on a hinge, so it can go up and down. So. But
I think we're going to go and listen to Stefan talk to David now. But just one last question: do you have an orange bathrobe like the one that Herod wears?
I wish. Wouldn't it be great? And a wife beater? Awesome. That'd be wonderful. Just walk around the house like that. Yeah, I think Richard Margerson took it from the COC. He felt so in love with it.
Oh, it looked great. So Atom Egoyan is with us here in Toronto. We're expecting questions from Toronto and Oslo, and now I think we'll listen to David talk to Stefan.
Beautiful. It gives me both pleasure and it's an honor to introduce Stefan Herheim, who came to international attention, well, it's hard to say, but in any case, certainly with his production of Parsifal in 2008 at Bayreuth. Since then, among his many notable productions, Lohengrin at the Staatsoper Berlin in 2009. He's currently preparing I Vespri Siciliani for Covent Garden this year, Meistersinger von Nürnberg for Salzburg, and the Opéra de Bastille also this year. Among many awards, I'm not sure if I got the count right. By the logic of my previous presentation, it should have been 7 times, but my understanding is that he's been awarded this extraordinary distinction of being Director of the Year or producing the Production of the Year by the international opera magazine Opernwelt 3 times, which is an unprecedented distinction. It is, I think, exciting and noteworthy that Stefan Herheim is presenting Salome in Oslo, because like Atom Egoyan at the COC in Toronto, Stefan Herheim is a hometown boy, and I suppose a hometown favorite, which makes for some amount of conflict because, as you heard from Hedda, this was a very controversial production in Salzburg, and his productions historically have been enormously controversial. So I, as an outsider yesterday, sensed the sort of hesitation in the audience, because it seems like a very provocative production, and yet the audience seemed entirely thrilled. So I wonder if we could start with that. That is, this seems, by all accounts, to be an enormously scandalous piece, and I thought this was supposed to be an international scandal, and the production seemed to have all the trappings of scandal, and yet the audience seemed entirely excited. So I wonder whether we could start by talking a little bit about your thinking about Salome.
Well, it's time and place for everything, as you know, also from the piece, and also by doing productions. You get caught by the room and the time you're working in, and producing this show in Salzburg, not at the summer bigger festival, but at the very exclusive Easter festival, which has a very short tradition, very bound to the orchestra of the Berlin Philharmonic, which was led by Sir Simon Rattle, as he still is leading it, with 2 performances giving, actually, for this huge production.
Excuse me, Oslo, we can't, I'm sorry, Stefan, to interrupt you, but your mic isn't working or it's not functioning correctly. Okay. So if we could have that corrected, maybe?
Is it better now? Can you hear me, Toronto?
Yes. We hear you. Thank you.
Okay. Well, as I said, there's a time and place for everything, and it's a very special place to work, of course, for the Easter Festival in Salzburg, producing very exclusively, and being a very traditional festival, exclusively made also by Karajan for his orchestra, the Berlin Philharmonics. And if you also then do only 2 performances, the prices are extremely high, and this orchestra also produced a very high sound, a fantastic sound, but a very loud sound. So I think a lot of the booing you were referring to in Salzburg didn't necessarily only hit the production of mine, but the fact that people were not fulfilled in the meaning of really getting the sound of the singers. You know, so there are things we have to look into here, and it's a huge show, and I think in many ways also, of course, the Norwegians or the Norwegian audience might be more open-minded towards certain operatic traditions, which were, I'm sure, not really fulfilled, or the expectations by a traditional audience were not fulfilled in a way in Salzburg, which may then, of course, feel provocative for some reason.
Maybe we could talk for a moment about the piece itself. As I was leaving yesterday from the performance, an older man and a younger woman were in front of me. And the older man said, quite loudly, there was so much going on that I simply couldn't understand. And the younger woman responded, really? I thought it was completely transparent. So it would seem as though the production, so the question was, do you have a sense that the production is in some sense more readily understood by a generation that in some sense is used to processing all kinds of input. I'll start there.
Yeah, well, you may call it a postmodern language, I guess, in the meaning of it's referring to very many different things, but it tries also, of course, if you'd see it from my point of view, it's a very transparent, clear story we are telling. I don't know how much I'm supposed to declare, so to say, the way of using a production like this. I think it has to talk for itself, and definitely it does on many levels. I consider myself also someone spectating the show with my ears, and I try to translate what I hear for my my eyes, and we have very different perspectives and possibilities to spectate and listen, of course. My brother told me, what was this? Because he was certainly not connected any minute with this music. He was just confused all the time. He had very big problems finding a track, so to say, to follow musically, which is understandable from one perspective, very understandable from another one, depending, of course, where you come from.
And perhaps we could talk for a moment about your own entry into this piece. That is there a sense in engaging the piece that there was a particular point or a particular intersection for you with this material?
Well, feeling as a musician myself, and being a musician myself within this job and this work, I am, of course, having a huge problem when I'm confronted with the sound of this score, because it suddenly makes clear that we are trying to put names and words on something that has to remain a mystery, so to say, the mystery of music, the mystery of subconscious sound, which each and any one of us will find a totally different way to approach. But having to do a kind of, you have to start somewhere. Yeah? Atom started with this, as you have been telling us about this production, about a rape. I think my approach was very similar, but not from that kind of realistic perspective, but seeing, so to say, 2,000 years of Christianity, 2,000 years of man history, also as a kind of rape of the idea of a woman, actually a rape of our world, being a woman when we talk in more mythological ways. The moon, which is, of course, a huge attraction, important prop in this opera, also for the wonderful sound of the text by Wilde. The moon becomes very clearly a projection, representing, symbolizing the woman itself. And the light, of course, of the moon is just a reflection again from the sun, being in the language, in the French language, in which Wilde wrote his play, of course, being masculine. And from this kind of very mythological, archaic analysis of where do we come from, who are we, I start, so to say, the construction of a piece, or deconstruction of a piece to construct a scenery for it. And it's all about a head, ending up with a head of a man on the night of a birthday of a king, who in our show then also ends at this birthday. He dies on this day. So I read everything, of course, then very symbolically somehow, and take sounds of the words as reflected in the partitura extremely seriously as a dramaturgic, creating a consens or nonsense, depending on what you want to explain. But finding this kind of edges, and then from there you go and start, and you find suddenly your very logical explanation for the symmetrical boundings and the complex psychological muster, I would say.
The sort of structure of the
exactly,
piece.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about this sense of play and of theatricality that seems to animate a lot of the production. There are moments in which, when the Salomes come and dance, there is a sense of not just the arrival of these otherworldly creatures, but the arrival of highly theatricalized creatures and a kind of sense of the different world also being not at all a realistic world, but a very theatrical world. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about that.
Well, it's a man's world, and Oscar Wilde, of course, knew that very clearly. Also, when he produced for this world in the Victorian England, amusing his audience with his wild comedies, as we know and love them, and then bringing up, of course, issues with this biblical reference, shocking an audience, and shortly after being imprisoned himself, so to say, as the oracle, subconscious voice of a whole culture. So what's the question? I'm sorry.
In that context, that is, in a context in which you're engaging Oscar Wilde, mythological materials, there seems to be a streak of play in the production, and I wanted to ask you about that.
No, it's the way Wilde then goes with the perfume of the words, the sound of the words, being such an inspiring moment for Richard Strauss, who we know is the master of transparence in the meaning of creating seducing chaos within ourselves, twisting our heads and seducing us totally to the point where we are really in danger of losing ourselves. For me, there's an aspect of, in this aesthetic of this score, of Strauss' way of composing for the stage, there's a question about ethics, which becomes actually a moral problem. And I think it was, throughout the time of this opera, a huge problem for the bourgeoisie, also to accept the fact that we are actually all, so to say, subliming the perversity of our lusts, to see a story which we condemn in some way, and the reproduced shock of the story becomes the joy and lust of all our voyeurism, of course. And this kind of perversion, how art itself redeems us from our own sins, so to say, or our needs to recreate the world we are living in, to make this place a better place. I think a world working ideally, an ideal world would never need art, you know? Art is a huge center for compensation of things not working. And within that concept, of course, we get the creators of reality. We are, with the possibility of creating at all, actually created in God's picture, as it's also biblically said. And this is the moment of taking responsibility, of taking the notice of power. And I think exactly in this philosophical frame, the conflict for Herod actually is played out, but in a very neurotic way, and on many levels, where each character becomes almost, for me, representing one part of a dissociated character. That's why I'm playing also, of course, with this kind of psychological departing of different characters, and talking about Trinity also, of course. We have three men and we have three women in this piece, and all these three men are actually dying. So it's also a very, it's some kind also connected to Nietzsche, and the saying, God is definitely dead. And the man is dead
Before we tackle Nietzsche, I'm happy to send the mic, at least virtually, back to Toronto, where you guys have been collecting questions. And I think at the same time we'll be doing so here. So I just want to remind our audience there are instructions here on how to forward questions in our audience. And in the meantime, Brent, I'm figuring that you have questions over there.
Well, my first question is actually whether Adam and Stefan would like to ask each other anything.
I'm just enjoying this because it feels like Hockey Night in Canada, and we have a play-by-play with commentators. It's great, you know, like this is between periods or something. So it's sorry, I just had to say it. It was great. It's very good to meet you, Stefan. Hello.
Hello. Hi.
I'm very sorry I couldn't see your production. The images look so tantalizing, and so hopefully our paths will cross one day. That would be great.
I have a question from an audience member here, Stefan, and the question is: explain the use of the canon and the reason for it.
Well, it's very much as we know, and as you've also been talking about already. It's a question of who's spectating what object and what's the subject of spectation in the piece. It's all about watching someone, and it's often also in this piece less about what you watch than who is watching, you know. Mm-hmm. And this search for God in this piece, with this immense search for God, as if he was the only reason that man can, so to say, go on living, and found his power on the existence of God. They're shouting to each other all the time in this dreadful Jew quintet. Is he visible or not? And in what kind will God be visible for us? For me, this is a very psychological moment. It's showing, so to say, also the idiocy of the whole concept of God, the way man has created him in their picture. So it's a big penis, of course. It can dance, it can move around, and it's a bridge between these two levels we have, because the whole stage actually works on a very strange way as like a black hole. It's like we're really watching into a black hole, into the mystery of something suppressed. And there's an instrument there, a created, handcrafted, made instrument. It's a monster. It looks also like a gun, and it's used like a cannon, and it has something dreadful about it, and it's spinning all the time around this hole in the middle from which this prophet voice is. So it's like this voice also gives the power to the cannon, actually. Mm-hmm. So it's also a subconscious energy giving the power to watch into a universe which is turned upside down, because we are not watching into the universe, we are being the universe around this moon, this satellite, which is, so to say, enlightening the whole action and what we are watching. And around this moon, what would you call it, balancing, so to say, on this edge of the moon, is this family of three people, the stepfather, the mother, and Salome herself. And she forces, so to say, her parents to look into this hole, where we have a kind of strange reflection of what could have taken place at this party, at this night, at the court of the king, who captivates the prophet. He is so afraid of listening to himself, but he keeps him there. And as we know from the story before the story, actually the father of Salome himself was kept for 12 years in that well before Herod dared to send Naaman down there and cut his head off as well. So it's a dreadful family we are facing here, and there are very trivial moments in the way they communicate, or actually do not communicate, but project on each other. And for me, the whole opera is written actually from the point of from the perspective of someone enjoying to see and stylicize and create a room for his own destruction, self-destruction. It's of course, a clear thing also that men wrote operas throughout history always about women, you know, that has to be, so to say, put on stage by the gods of this world to somehow, yeah, shapen up the fact that we were thrown out of that paradise at that time because of Eve taking down that wonderful apple from a tree. She was not supposed to. But I mean, she was smart enough to see there's something wrong about that concept. And we seem to suffer from that since ever.
Stefan, thank you. And it's amazing how many ideas you can cram into one answer. That was great. This is a question from Caroline. It is for Adam. I believe this is for Adam. Is video the upcoming trend in opera staging? And I think she indicates that she hopes it's not.
I hope it's not too. I think it's very limited. I think that I used it here specifically for the live transmission of Johanna Hahn's Lips as a way of introducing the singer, but also this notion of something that's detached, disembodied, that gives us once access, but also alienates us. But the notion of a video being used in a way that would make the dramatic action more available to the viewer, I think is fundamentally in opposition to what opera does. Opera is about the phenomenon of seeing the unamplified human on stage being able to extend their vocal instrument to this place, which is unworldly. That's the fundamental experience of it.
Did you see Tristan?
Yes.
And what did you think of the way video was used there?
For the first two acts, I hated it.
You should perhaps tell the Oslo audience that you're referring to this Bill Viola production that Peter Sellers
correct.
Yeah.
Sorry, Oslo.
Yeah. Right. The first two acts didn't work. The first two acts didn't work at all for me, but the third act I think is brilliant. I think the Liebestod is amazing. But that's because at that point the imagery becomes more abstract.
Yes.
And actually I'm able to forgive the first two acts for what the third act does.
Okay.
Can I jump in there, Brent, just for a moment to follow up on that? I mean, whether or not video is the future of opera, I mean, I totally get Adam's sense of hesitation. But it seems to me that it's undoubtedly the present of opera, which is to say not in the sense that we're talking about as stagecraft, but that the recording industry, which used to be an audio form, has now become a video form, right? Which is to say DVDs are the form in which opera circulates. And if Adam can't be here to see Stefan's Salome, he can get a DVD of Stefan's Bohème. And for the most part, my guess is that's the way the way opera production is circulating in this world. So to that extent, I wonder whether we could talk about, opera production in a medial world of DVDs and recordings in cinemas.
In the video live transmissions too, which are incredibly popular.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But again, though, there's this imposition of one director upon another. Very often, when I watch the live transmissions, I would rather have a static camera giving me the full high-def, version. But having these internal cuts and these weird dollies and tracks, which seem so random, are really upsetting. Like they really, they're a violation of what the stage director intended. So I have real problems with it, even though I understand that it's a growing phenomenon. It also, unfortunately, is depleting audiences for live opera, in smaller cities especially. On my hometown on the west coast of Canada, Victoria, the local opera company is suffering because everyone's going to the drive-in suburban experience of seeing the Met. So it's a real challenge.
I have a question here from Sandra for Adam, which is, how curious are you of Stefan's production?
Very. No, it looks. I'm totally. I'm tantalized by it. Look. I do think we're both talking about this. What do you do with the head? What does the head mean at the end? The severed head. And in my production, the blindfold becomes very important. And this notion of what he doesn't choose to see, the fact that the real transmission for her is not the kiss, but it's the taking off of the blindfold, putting it on herself, and having this sense of communion with him through his desire to avoid this spectacle, to blind himself. And so she blinds herself as well. But this idea of immersing herself physically into the head is really exciting. And I think it's kind of an amazing concept. It's funny, I heard about it through Erica. So I had a very different idea of what the visual sense would be. But of course, she's talking about it as a singer, what it would mean to be inside that mouth. But no, I love this idea that you as you said, Stefan, it's you start with a place, you start with an act, you start with some thing that you are trying to understand and wrestle with, and that informs the whole production in a number of different ways.
A question for Stefan. I like that the Salomes kill their observers. How did you decide to do that? Is it about figures of fantasy rebelling against their creators?
Can you help me translating that?
Gerne. Gerne haben Sie gesehen, wie die Zuschauer, die umgebracht werden von den Salomes.
Yeah, in the dance.
Wie, ja.
Well, of course, it's a huge revenge program, so to say. It's a frenetic, big Las Vegas show where the joy of fulfillment through watching these 7 girls dancing around ends up with a kind of orgasm, being the petit mort, as the French would say. You know, it's eros thanatos. You know, only by getting killed you can, so to say, be redeemed from the whole situation of tension. And as Adam said in the beginning, the whole dance is about so much energy. It's really about dynamics, and you have to find you have to create a dramaturgy within that and tell a very clear development of structure. Because Strauss doesn't say anything himself. What is actually supposed to take place? You have the 7 wheels, of course, but you don't necessarily even hear them where they're supposed to fall. I analyzed this it really searched the wheels in the music. I never found one, you know. So, but you have to create something on the information you've got, and of course, it's a wonderful picture of the 7, the happiness. Somewhere over the rainbow, you will die. That became, so to say, the context of redemption within this dance moment. So we have the 7 wheels representing the 7 colors in the rainbow, fulfilling, so to say, the whole spectra of this woman who is gathered in the color of white when all these colors comes together, and she becomes the light of redemption actually at the end, redeeming herself through death, of course, but becoming, so to say, this Christ figure, which is all the time longed for by men in this story, but which is a character of death and a cult of death, actually.
But the question, as I understood it, and forgive me for not translating it entirely, was also: is this a moment of revenge? That is, if the piece is in some sense about the victimization, voyeurization of women, and the fact that these Salomes then start to butcher the assembled guests. My understanding, Brent, of the question was, you know, is that a moment when, in some sense, the tables are turned?
I think that might, is the person who asked the question here? That's what you mean? Yes, absolutely. It's an absolutely from Toronto.
Ist das einigermaßen klar?
Nicht
Als
wirklich,
Frage.
nee,
Das
als
heißt,
Frage.
wenn die Frauen dann plötzlich dazu kommen, die Männer umzubringen, die da zuschauen und die da lustvoll sie beäugeln, ist das ein Moment, wo sozusagen die Frauen dann jetzt eine gewisse Rache ausüben?
Yeah, but the question is rache or revenge is not necessarily the right word, because for me it's much more like a program, and you cannot stop it. You have pushed the button, you have started this, and it will go on, and it can only end in that moment of total
It's very
dissociation.
interesting. It's very interesting, actually, because when you said that, Stefan, it reminded me of in my early days in conceptualizing. You said this moment of going over the score and trying to find the moments of the veil drop. And I remember that as well, that it's very open and it's not specific. And I remember that was a clue in itself, that there was, as you said, this sense of something that had been unleashed, but it wasn't measured. It wasn't, and the fact that, you know, the music seems to be so programmatic in so many different ways, but the fact that that was not specified, I found very inspiring in a way. That it was a continuum, as you said. There was just something that was being, and in my case, it was this notion of a flashback, which just sort of played out as a continuum. And in your case, obviously, that inspired this notion of a button that had been pushed, and it was leading to some sort of a demolition.
I'm very sure that Richard Strauss appreciates that we don't take that literally all the time with the wheels as well, with his music.
Hey, Brent, I have a question here from Oslo for both directors, if I may. This being Norway and there being privacy concerns that I'm sure the EU has dictated, I won't name the questioner, but I will articulate the question. This person wanted to know whether each of you watched or specifically, watched other productions of the work before starting work on the production process? And do other productions inform your work, and if so, how?
Adam?
Well, I was directly informed by a pre-existing production here in Toronto, which I had seen, and which was very literal, very faithful to the original setting. And in a way that liberated me, because we had that production. And so I was dealing in 1996, when this was first presented, with an audience where that production was very fresh. And so they could go somewhere very different. The fact that I was actually unleashed from a literal reading of the text was very inspiring, and that came out of my witnessing of that show.
Well, I grew up with this music. My father was playing this piece in the orchestra, and I think I was 6 years old when I actually was like hanging myself on him, saying, "I want to see that." And I immediately after got the old recording, the lines of recording, and it became a favorite very early. So I'm kind of a perverted opera freak from the very beginning, and this is my revenge, so to say, towards my parents.
I see. So the Salome figure as the child forcing the parents to look into the abyss seems to map onto your biography.
Let's stop there.
Okay.
I have a question here for Adam, and this is from Gwen, who says she's talking as a creative director. In terms of the theme of madness, is there a point in which your development as creative director becomes intuitive?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if I understand it, even though the English is very clear. Well, I think that here's an odd response to a very, very interesting question, and it was alluded to earlier on. One of the really interesting aspects of this phenomenon of opera as a director is that you are working with singers, in this case, in this new production, who have performed this many times before. Mm-hmm. So they are arriving with a composite of all the different versions of Salome. Mm-hmm. And in this production, where there is a sense of her being somewhat narcoticized, being quite still, and of that becoming gradually unhinged, what's also being unhinged at that point and being released somehow are the phantoms of all these other versions that particular singer has played. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I have no control over, and it's an amazing thing to witness. I became very aware of it this time because Erica has sung so many different productions of Salome. Mm-hmm. A disturbing number where she played a petulant teenager. Mm-hmm. And so I saw glimmers or phantoms of those productions and various gestures that began to appear, which I had no control over, and I'm not sure she had either, but they were residual and quite volatile, like and fascinating to watch. So that became a form of madness, and something which, as I said, we were surprised by with every performance. It was unexpected as to where and how that would intersect with another version she had played.
It's interesting, an interesting answer. But by that term, and by that definition, every singer who's performed the role previously is bringing their own kind of madness to every role.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what makes a very, it's such a fascinating form for that reason. Mm. And then you're working with singers also in this production who have never sung anything like that, like Richard Margeson. Mm-hmm. And then you have like Hannah Schultz. I mean, amazing that she was on our stage. And I first saw her in the Goetz Frederick video. With Teresa Stratas, and she played the page. Mm-hmm. So it was amazing to see, this really very attractive young page from the 70s mm-hmm. now playing Herodias. Yes. So that was really interesting. Just this notion of a tradition. She was actually our
Herodias as well in Salzburg in this production. So we shared
fantastic.
That one. Yeah.
That's how I know about your production, actually, is through her. So there you go.
And she brought phantoms of your production to Adam's production as well.
She was
the direct emissary. The direct emissary.
Yeah.
She just didn't bring the orange hair, I'm thinking.
No.
I have a question, if I may, here. The names have popped up, so forgive my pronunciation. A question from Sin for Stefan Herheim, and it's a rather pointed one, so fasten your seatbelt. Why put a dinner jacket on Yohanan when the renaissance of male religious fundamentalism today is making Salome actually such a relevant and contemporary work? And then there's a follow-up question. Why 7 Marilyn Monroes instead of the real and contemporary provocation of veils in today's society?
Yeah, that's two big ones. The Marilyn Monroe thing, many saw her immediately as Marilyn. That was not my idea. I'm thinking much more intuitively myself, in the meaning of putting a black-clothed woman close to a look-alike in white, and then exchange dresses and colors. But of course, you are playing with icons. And for me, Lolita was much closer to refer to something which for me was the way we historically, the closest we get a clear decadence we can cope with from some kind of distance, just like Strauss had distance to Wilde, and Wilde had distance to his predecessors. And I think this is important to receive art, actually, to have some kind of distance which makes you, it gives you the vocabulary, so to say, to analyze. Was the 50s and the 60s, and then the bourgeoisie society and family ideal of a very much American-looking, iconic, in a ballroom dress, acting family, celebrating a birthday. So we went from there, and from that moment on, it never actually occurred to me that we might have to reconsider that kind of historical placing, since this show then goes, as you said, so cosmologically out in many other associative rooms, and takes time from the very beginning out on a total different level, as we have all the guests in the hybrid mind of Herod being all the kings and gods, emperors through the history. Which he seems then in his hybrids to identify with, inviting them to his party. But of course, they are just illusions, so to say, part of this ice-cold universe in which he is caught like in his old black room and subconscious. And this is ruled by Salome. The question also of religion and the meaning, in that tradition of seeing the kings and the hybrids of him, I thought it's nothing political about this. In any way, and if you do try to focus on the politics, then you end up with something which doesn't really make this very attractive. I don't want to have a Jewish Talmud discussion after having done Salome by Richard Strauss. It certainly doesn't belong into that context. So for me, it was much more about the idea of God in itself and the monotheismo. So we took the three monotheistic world religions and put this group of fanatic discussers trying to find God into this quintet. It's a big question about the wheels, of course, but I'm sorry, but this kind of decadence we are confronting here, I think it's much more about our moral and the philosophic aspect of recreating reality on stage as a compensation for reality not working, also historically within our cultural, artistical history, so to say. It's a problem for me, actually. It's a moral problem for me to recreate a drama written in 1905 again and again and again, instead of writing new operas, new stories. And I would prefer that we do that, but I'm not asked to do these pieces, and I don't have time in the situation I came up to concentrate on that. So it gets much more about taking a few steps back and watching where we come from to hopefully find a way into a future changing us.
Thank you very much. I think we've exhausted the questions here in Toronto. How are things looking in Oslo?
I have a question for Stefan. I mean, if you were to be critical of your own production, because I often, I navel gaze and I look at my own work. And I think, I mean, the danger of my production is that it's, it reduces it all to something very specific, to this very specific trauma. And so I think that is in some ways, reductivist maybe, and how do you feel? Like if you were to look at, now you've seen it now a couple of times. I've certainly seen my production with over a number of years in different sort of versions of it. How are you feeling now the morning after?
Well, we didn't only have a big party with wonderful singers yesterday, but I also feel a bit knocked out by myself, actually, by reproducing this. And I'm sure if I had to, or I don't know, it sounds so negative, had to, if I should ever do a Salome production again, I would start somewhere totally different. I'm quite sure. I still trust very much the approach in itself and the way of reflecting this material. But I'm not sure if it really came over, so to say, or if that conflict of morality, which occurs to me actually critical. As I said, in the moment where we adore this music and let us seduced by the possibility of fulfilling this dramatic frame in an exhausted, in a theatrical, inspiring way, we I don't know. We cut ourselves
It's very
off.
interesting what you're saying, because I think that one of the things, I remember when I first did it, I felt, oh, this is amazing. If this is, and it was successful, I thought we can do this again, and I'll be back in this world. And yet I'm realizing that the person I was when I did this in the 90s, it's a very different person than who I am now. And that you're kind of in this strange place when you're remounting work, that you can see that if you had the opportunity to start right from the beginning, that you would have learned something else completely different, and yet you're constricted by this interpretation.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing for a film
change
director to
when
say,
you-
Adam, because when you commit to a film, it's done, and it's gone,
done.
right?
The film is done, and you can watch it again, but you don't have to go into the process of explaining it to actors again. You don't have to relive it and realize that there are that you are trying to inhabit a person that you were, as opposed to who you are. It's very, very complex.
But you revived the show in Toronto yourself, Atom, didn't you?
Yeah, I did.
times.
And I'm glad I did, because it was, like these were, we had an amazing cast. And I mean, I was really thankful to be able to work with them. But I was also aware of the fact that I was inhabiting a persona that wasn't who I am right now.
Mm.
Anyway, just an interesting thing to when you talk about madness. I suppose if you keep doing that, you become completely mad. So.
Audience, I'm going to sign off from Toronto at this point, and I'd like to thank all of you for being with us. And I also want to thank TIFF and their team, especially Andre, Janessa, Melanie, Daniela, and the tech team. Very special thank you to Johannes de Boos, who gave us some splendid productions this year, and we'll be back again next year. He's the music director for COC. Very nice to have Johannes with us. And to
Bye,
Atom
Johannes.
Egoyan.
I'd love to see you in Bregenz. I hope that's going to work out.
He's waving at you, Stefan. He's waving.
And to Atom Egoyan, who is the director of Salome, and will next year be directing Cose fan tutte for the Canadian Opera Company in a brand new production, and it's going to be spectacular, so I can't wait for that. And also to Gianmarco Segato for working extremely hard and helping put together what was an extremely technically smooth conversation with Oslo, and I hope you found it interesting as well. And thanks to all of you for coming in on such a beautiful afternoon. And once again, to our guests in Oslo, back over to David and Stefan now, and to Mimi.
I think Mimi.
I'm going to say goodbye. I'm going to say thank you to David, who flew all the way from Chicago here. He's a professor in performance studies at the University of Chicago. Thank you to Stefan for staying on for another day, although the party went on until today. Thank you from here. We're so happy that this happened. This is hopefully a beginning of a conversation that will keep going, keep exploring these kind of works, this kind of new angles, new ways of telling stories, new ways of challenging the truth. And Toronto, don't be a stranger. Thank you.
Don't be a stranger, Oslo.
Good night.
Good night. Bye. Thank you.